This is a video lesson for Module 5, Lesson 23. The Lesson 23 learning target is I can add and multiply unit fractions to build fractions greater than 1 using visual models. So today's lesson is going to be all about looking at how we can group unit fractions together using addition and multiplication to get answers of mixed numbers and whole numbers that are greater than 1. So let's take a look at a little bit of what we're doing in the first problem here. So in the first problem here, I'm going to be finding whole number equivalents of different copies of 1/3. So you've seen that I've already set up a list of copies of 1/3. So I have 1 copy of 1/3, 2 copies, 3 copies, and so on, all the way up to 10 copies of 1/3, which is the same as 10/3. And so I'm going to be finding the whole number equivalents, and I'm going to be writing the whole numbers below the fraction that represents them. So for example, in my head I'm thinking, how many thirds is going to equal 1 whole? So I'm picturing like a tape diagram in my head. And I'm like, well, if this is 1 whole, it's going to be 1, 2, 3 thirds that equals one whole. So I know that 3 thirds is going to equal 1 whole. And by that logic, I can say, well, 3 more copies of 1/3 will be 6 thirds, so that's going to equal 2. And then 3 more copies of 1/3 is going to be 9 thirds, and that's going to equal 3 wholes. So I've found the whole number equivalents to 1, 2, and 3 wholes as 3 thirds equaling 1 whole, 6 thirds equaling 2 wholes, and 9 thirds equaling 3 wholes. So being able to group unit fractions together and figure out how many of those unit fractions equal whole numbers is going to be helpful to figuring out multiplication and addition sentences involving unit fractions. So let's take a look at how we can use this for our next problem here. So we're going to be using parentheses to show how to make wholes out of the following multiplication sentence. So I have the multiplication 12 times 1/4. So this is the same as 12 copies of 1/4. So I'm going to rewrite this as an addition sentence. It's going to take me a little while because I have to actually write out all 12 copies of 1/4 being added together. But when I do this, I'm going to be able to demonstrate a little easier how we can figure out what the wholes equal for this problem. So far I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Looks like I'm going to need to zoom out a little bit. 11 and 12. Let me just double check that I have them. Just 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yep, so 12 copies of 1/4. And so I can use parentheses to show the wholes by grouping copies of 1/4 that make 1 whole. So once again, if I'm thinking about like a tape diagram, like, how many fourths make up 1 whole? Well, it's going to be 4 fourths that make up 1 whole, because there's 1, 2, 3, 4 and fourths in 1 whole. So I'm going to group 4 copies of 1/4 together and see how many wholes that this makes. So if I group these copies of 1/4 together, the 4 copies of 1/4, each one of these is going to be equal to 1 whole. And so I can see that 12 times 1/4, or 12 copies of 1/4, is equal to 3 wholes, because each one of these groups of parentheses right here is equal to 1 whole, and then those 1 wholes combined together is equal to 3. So 12 times 1/4 is equal to 3 wholes. So using the parentheses and grouping the unit fractions is another strategy we can use for this type of multiplication. One final strategy, and this one's a little more visual, is we can use a number line to show the multiplication of unit fractions and get our answer of a mixed number or a whole number. So in this problem, I'm going to be demonstrating this strategy using the equation 7 times 1/3. So there's actually a couple different ways that we can use the number line to get an answer for this problem. So actually, I think I'm going to need to make another copy of this number line here. So I'll move this number line down below, and I'll show you both of the different ways that we can use the number line to get an answer for this problem. So the first thing that we can do is we can simply show the jumps of 7 copies of 1/3. So we can say I'm going to start at 0, and I'm going to jump 7 copies of 1/3. So notice how I have my number line already partitioned into thirds, so I'm just showing the jumps. So there's 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, 4/3, 5/3, 6/3, and 7/3. And after making my jump of 7/3, I can just figure out where I am on the number line. In this case, I'm at 2 wholes and 1/3. So I get my answer of 2 1/3. And that's one way we could look at it. Another way is we can kind of use the learning that we just did in the previous 2 problems, and we can group the copies of 1/3 together to equal wholes. So I can say, hey, if I jump from 0 to 1, I know that's 3 copies of 1/3. And if I jump from 1 to 2, I know that's 3 more copies of 1/3. So in my head, I'm keeping track. I'm like 3 copies and 3 copies. Well, that's 6 copies. And so then I can just make one more small jump, or 1 copy of 1/3. And then that's going to equal my answer of 2 1/3. So I grouped here the whole numbers, and then whatever was left over, I just made that jump in my last little bit here, and I still get the same answer of 2 1/3. So that's 2 different strategies that we can use to find the answer for 7 times 1/3 using a number line. Now this strategy right here, the way we looked at the number line right here, we can actually do something similar numerically. So if we have 7 times 1/3, we can think in our heads, well, that's the same thing as 2 copies of 3/3, or 2 copies of 1 whole. And that's right here. We have, this is the same 3/3, that's 1 copy, and 3/3, that's another copy. And then plus 1 copy of 1/3, which is the same thing as 1/3, and that's this copy right here. And then this gives us the answer of 2, because 2 copies of 3/3 is the same thing as 2 times 1, and plus 1/3, which equals 2 1/3. So that's a way we can look numerically solve the same multiplication problem that's represented visually in this tape diagram right here. Sorry, not tape diagram, this number line right here. So that's pretty much what this lesson is all about, looking at different ways that we can add and multiply unit fractions and grouping them together to make whole numbers and mixed number answers. So now you should be prepared to answer all the questions in the lesson 23 problem set. But if you get stuck, you can always come back and rewatch parts of the video to help you out. So good luck on the problem set, and thanks for watching.